Oliver stepped off the bus with a big grin plastered across his face. It was his first day in the city, and the excitement of visiting a foreign land was too much to contain. He was a tourist in the capital of a country with centuries of royal history, famous for its grand palaces and traditions. But for Oliver, traditions were a joke. He didn't understand why people were so obsessed with them. The sun shone brightly in the sky as he adjusted his sunglasses and slung his backpack over one shoulder. He had come to see the sights, but not in the usual way. Oliver wasn't the type to stand in long lines for museums or pay attention to every historical detail. No, he had a different kind of adventure in mind. An adventure where he'd be the center of attention, of course. And that's exactly why he was walking toward the royal palace. He had heard about the royal guards, those famous statuesque figures who stood at attention, motionless, guarding the gates with their crisp uniforms and unblinking stares. People from all over the world marveled at their discipline, but to Oliver, they were just standing there doing nothing. How could anyone find that impressive? He couldn't understand it, but he certainly thought it would be fun to see if he could make them blink. As he approached the palace grounds, Oliver noticed a group of tourists gathered near the guards. They were all taking photos, speaking in hushed tones, and whispering about how impressive the guards looked. He rolled his eyes. It was all too much for him. What's so great about standing still? He muttered to himself, his voice drowned by the noise of the crowd. But as Oliver neared the guards, he saw something that made his smirk grow wider. One guard was standing alone, positioned by the main entrance, his feet planted firmly on the ground. The uniform was spotless, the hat perfectly placed, and the stance impeccable. To anyone else, the guard looked like a man who had perfected the art of silence and stillness. But to Oliver, he looked like the perfect target for some fun. With a glance around to make sure no one was paying too much attention, Oliver pulled out his phone and snapped a quick photo of the guard, stepping a little too close for comfort. He was so close now that he could almost touch the guard's shoulder. The guard's face remained as still as stone, not giving an inch. Oliver snickered to himself. This guy's a robot, not a human, he thought. The crowd was still buzzing around, but none of them seemed as bold as Oliver. They took their photos from a distance, but not him. He was different. He wanted to push boundaries. After all, what was the point of being in a new place if you couldn't have a little fun with the rules, right? Oliver took a few more photos, moving around the guard as if he was inspecting a statue. The guard didn't even flinch. Maybe I should try to get him to blink, Oliver thought. That would be hilarious. He stepped back, studying the guard's unmoving face. It was almost too perfect, too easy. He could feel a little thrill building up inside him as the idea came to him. He knew that some tourists had tried their luck by making faces or shouting at the guards to see if they would crack. But Oliver wasn't interested in just making faces. He had something else in mind, something that would definitely make the guard react. And as Oliver scanned his surroundings, he spotted the perfect opportunity. A street vendor nearby had bottles of water for sale. Without thinking twice, Oliver bought one. With a mischievous grin, he twisted the cap and splashed a small amount of water in the direction of the royal guard, aiming just enough to make a noticeable splash on the guard's uniform. It wasn't a lot, just enough to stir things up, to see what would happen. For a moment, there was complete silence. The crowd paused. The guard didn't move. The world seemed to hold its breath. But then, Oliver couldn't help but laugh. It was almost too funny. Here he was, standing in front of a royal guard, making him wet, and the guard hadn't even flinched. The reaction was exactly what Oliver expected, a perfectly composed, unbroken soldier who would not react, no matter how much he provoked him. Little did Oliver know, however, that this moment of fun would lead to something much bigger than he could have imagined. Oliver's laughter echoed in the air as the water splashed against the royal guard's uniform. He couldn't believe how easy it was to get away with something so bold. The crowd around him seemed to hold their breath. But the guard didn't even twitch. It was exactly what Oliver had expected. He thought to himself, This is going to be fun. He won't do anything. No one will. The tourists around Oliver glanced nervously at the guard, clearly uneasy, but Oliver didn't care. He was feeling proud of himself. The more he thought about it, the more he realized how amusing it was to be able to mess with something that everyone else treated with so much respect. "Look at him," Oliver whispered to a friend standing next to him. "He's just standing there like a statue. Doesn't even blink. It's almost like he's not even real." His voice was loud enough for a few nearby tourists to hear, and they exchanged awkward glances. Oliver felt a sense of power. He was making them uncomfortable, and he liked it. He leaned in closer to the guard, deliberately getting even closer than before. The guard's stance was still as solid as ever, his eyes locked straight ahead, focusing on something far beyond the crowd. Oliver felt a rush of excitement. It was a game now, a challenge to see how far he could push before the guard finally broke. Surely there was no way a human could stand still for this long. Is this guy even alive? Oliver asked aloud, though it was more to himself than anyone else, but the tourists around him didn't laugh. They just stared, some shaking their heads, others muttering quietly to each other. Oliver wasn't about to back down, though. He continued his show, acting like the guard wasn't even there. He took more photos, this time getting even closer. The flash went off in rapid succession, and he made exaggerated faces at the camera as if he were mocking the guard's serious expression. He leaned to the left, to the right, taking different angles, trying to make the moment even more dramatic. Oliver even began to imitate the guard's stiff posture, standing straight, puffing out his chest, and pretending to hold a sword in his hand. His friends laughed, but the tourists around him seemed uneasy. Some even whispered that what he was doing wasn't very respectful, but Oliver brushed it off. "They're just jealous. They probably wish they had the courage to mess with him like I do," he thought smugly. After a few more minutes of his antics, Oliver grew bored. He wanted something more, something that would really get a rise out of the guard. He turned to the small crowd of tourists who were watching and said, "Hey, does anyone want to see something funny? Watch this." With that, Oliver reached into his pocket and pulled out his water bottle again. He opened it, shaking it just a little for effect, before aiming it right at the guard's shoes. The water splashed across the guard's boots, sending a small spray in every direction. For a moment, it seemed like the whole world went quiet. The crowd stared, frozen, as if waiting for something, anything, to happen. But still, nothing. The guard didn't react, not even a blink. Oliver's smirk grew wider. He was certain the guard had no idea what to do now. How could anyone just stand there, not reacting to being mocked? But in that moment, something in Oliver's gut twisted. There was a strange feeling that he hadn't expected, a mix of guilt and uncertainty. Somehow, in all his teasing and mockery, he hadn't considered how out of place it might feel for the guard. What if this wasn't just some game? What if it meant something more? Oliver dismissed the thought immediately. This is just a guard. He's not real, just some guy in a uniform. Who cares? But before he could push that thought away entirely, something happened. A voice rang out from behind him. "You." The voice was sharp, clear, and full of authority. Oliver spun around, startled. Standing there was a tall man, wearing a military uniform, with a stern expression. The officer's eyes locked onto him, his gaze cold and unwavering. "You just crossed the line," the officer continued. "What you've done is disrespectful. Not just to him, but to the traditions that have been upheld for centuries. You will regret this." Oliver blinked, confused. He hadn't expected anything like this. He thought there would be no consequences. His smile faltered as the officer approached him. "Come with me," the officer said, his voice calm but firm, yet it sent a chill down Oliver's spine. The guard remained motionless in the background, his face unreadable, but Oliver was no longer laughing. He wasn't sure what was happening, but he knew he wasn't in control anymore. Oliver stood frozen as the officer's words sank in. For a brief moment, he thought he had heard the man wrong. Regret. What did he mean? He was just having a little fun, right? But the officer's stern face left no room for doubt. The situation was suddenly much more serious than Oliver had imagined. The officer took a step closer, his eyes never leaving Oliver's. You've disrespected more than just a royal guard. You've offended a tradition that's been respected for generations. The people here value this, and your actions have consequences. The officer's voice was firm, but there was no anger in it, only calm authority. Oliver could feel his heart start to race. What had started as a joke was quickly turning into something that could get him into trouble. It's just a stupid uniform, Oliver thought. Why is everyone making such a big deal about this? But despite his thoughts, Oliver couldn't help but feel a twinge of nervousness. He had seen the way the crowd had reacted to his behavior. Some of them had even looked disappointed in him, shaking their heads. And now, the officer was standing there, telling him that his actions had consequences. The weight of that hit him harder than he expected. "Do you understand what you've done?" the officer asked, his eyes scanning Oliver's face. Oliver opened his mouth to respond but realized he didn't know what to say. He had been so sure of himself earlier, so confident that he could get away with anything. But now, he wasn't so sure. He hadn't thought about the tradition, or the significance behind the guard's presence. All he had seen was a man standing still, waiting for something to happen. I didn't mean any harm," Oliver said slowly, trying to find the right words. "I just thought it was funny, you know. I didn't know it was such a big deal." The officer raised an eyebrow, unimpressed. "You may not have known, but now you do. And it's not just about the guard. It's about respect for the people and their customs. What you did wasn't a joke, it was an insult." Oliver opened his mouth again, but no words came out. He felt embarrassed, his face flushing with a mix of shame and confusion. He had never been in a situation like this before. He had always been the one in control, the one who made the rules. He had never had to answer for his actions, never had to worry about consequences. But now, standing there in front of the officer, he realized how much trouble he might have caused. His eyes shifted to the royal guard, still standing motionless in the background. "What if I've ruined everything?" he thought. "What if they take this seriously?" The officer's expression softened, but he didn't back down. "What you've done is a mistake, but there's a way to make it right." He paused for a moment before continuing. "You're going to have to apologize. Publicly." Oliver felt his stomach drop. Apologize. The word sounded foreign to him. He wasn't used to apologizing, especially not for something he thought was harmless. But the officer's tone made it clear that there was no other option. I'm sorry," Oliver muttered, his voice barely above a whisper. He glanced at the officer, then at the crowd that had gathered to watch the whole exchange. They were all staring at him now, waiting for him to take responsibility for his actions. The officer nodded, seemingly satisfied with the apology, but Oliver could tell that it wasn't enough. He had to do more. He had to do it the right way. "Let's go," the officer said, gesturing toward the palace gates. "We'll go together. You will apologize directly to the guard." Oliver felt a lump form in his throat. He had no idea how this was going to unfold, but he knew one thing for sure. It was not going to be easy. He had never had to apologize like this before, let alone to someone in a royal uniform. But as he walked with the officer toward the guard, the weight of the situation became clear. This was no longer a game. It was a lesson in humility. The crowd began to part as they approached the guard, who remained as still as ever, completely unaware of what was happening behind him. Oliver's heart pounded in his chest. He had no idea what to say, but he knew he had to say something meaningful. This wasn't just about his pride anymore. It was about showing respect. Oliver's heart pounded in his chest as he walked beside the officer toward the royal guard. The weight of the situation had finally settled in, and the lighthearted mood he had once felt was replaced by nervousness. He had never imagined that a simple joke could lead to something so serious. As they approached the guard, the crowd began to stir. People whispered among themselves, their eyes following Oliver with curiosity. Some of them seemed to be waiting for what would happen next, while others looked disappointed by his actions. Oliver wished he could disappear, but he knew there was no way to avoid what was coming. The officer stopped just a few feet away from the guard and turned to face Oliver. "This is your chance to make it right," he said quietly, his voice calm but firm. "You're going to apologize. Do it now, and mean it." Oliver swallowed hard, his mouth dry. He had never had to apologize for anything in front of so many people, especially not to someone who seemed so unshakable. The guard had barely moved since the incident, his posture as perfect as it had been from the moment Oliver first laid eyes on him. He looked like a statue, unbothered by anything going on around him. It only made Oliver feel more nervous. "Go ahead," the officer said, gesturing toward the guard. "He's waiting." Oliver stepped forward slowly, feeling his legs tremble beneath him. He glanced at the guard, who still hadn't moved. The guard's face was unreadable, his expression stoic, as if he hadn't noticed the small crowd that had gathered or the splash of water that had soaked his boots earlier. He looked like someone who had seen it all before and wouldn't be swayed by anything. For a moment, Oliver wondered if the guard was even aware of what had happened. Was he just so disciplined that he didn't care, or was he simply ignoring Oliver? Whatever the case, it didn't matter now. Oliver had to apologize, and there was no turning back. "Excuse me," Oliver said, his voice sounding unsteady. He cleared his throat and tried again, this time louder. "I'm sorry for what I did. I didn't mean to disrespect you. I was just messing around, and I didn't realize how important this is." The guard didn't move. He didn't say anything. It was like he hadn't even heard Oliver. The silence between them stretched on, and Oliver felt his face growing redder by the second. Was this all there was to it? Just stand there and stare? But then, just as Oliver was about to take a step back, something changed. The guard's eyes, which had been locked straight ahead, slowly shifted to meet Oliver's gaze. It wasn't a sharp look or a glare, but just a quiet, steady gaze. For a moment, it felt like the entire world had paused, and Oliver couldn't look away. There was no anger in the guard's eyes, no sign of frustration or annoyance. There was only calmness. It was as if the guard understood that Oliver had made a mistake and was waiting for him to truly understand the gravity of it. Oliver felt a lump form in his throat. He had expected a harsh response, maybe even some punishment, but instead, he found himself facing something far more powerful: quiet dignity. In that moment, Oliver realized that the guard wasn't just standing still because he couldn't move. He was standing still because he had chosen to. He was representing something bigger than himself, something that demanded respect, not through force, but through his actions and presence. "I really am sorry," Oliver repeated, this time with more sincerity. He couldn't help but feel humbled by the guard's calmness, by his quiet strength. He wasn't expecting a forgiveness he didn't deserve, but somehow just standing in front of this man made Oliver realize how much he had misjudged the whole situation. The officer, still standing nearby, nodded in approval. "You've done well," he said, his voice softer now. "You've learned something today. Not all lessons are easy, but this one is important." Oliver looked back at the guard, who still hadn't said a word. There was no apology or acknowledgement of Oliver's words, but that was okay. Oliver didn't need that. The guard's stillness and composure were enough to make him understand what he had done wrong. As Oliver stepped back, he realized something important. Respect wasn't something you earned through bravado or showing off. It was something you gave, without expectation, without trying to get anything in return. And sometimes, it was the quiet moments, like this one, that taught the hardest lessons. He looked around at the crowd, who were all watching him now, waiting to see how he would react. Oliver wasn't sure what they were expecting, but he knew that what had happened today would stay with him for a long time. He had learned the importance of humility, and he wasn't about to forget it anytime soon. Oliver stood there, feeling a strange mixture of relief and embarrassment. The royal guard had not responded to his apology, and yet there was something in the way the guard stood that left a lasting impression. He hadn't said a word, but it felt like he had said everything Oliver needed to hear. The officer beside him gave him a short nod, signaling that the apology was enough for now. "You've done what's necessary," the officer said quietly. "But this isn't over. There are still consequences for your actions. You will need to face them." Oliver blinked. Consequences. What did that mean? He had thought that simply saying sorry would end things, that the whole embarrassing situation would be over. But now, it seemed there was more to it than just a few words of regret. The officer turned, motioning for Oliver to follow him. The crowd around them began to disperse, but some people still whispered, their eyes glancing back at Oliver. He could feel their stares, and they made him feel even more uncomfortable. His face burned with the knowledge that many of them had watched him make a fool of himself. He had thought he was the center of attention in a fun way. But now it felt different, like the eyes of everyone in the crowd were judging him. "Where are we going?" Oliver asked, his voice uncertain. The officer didn't answer right away, but led him through a side gate, away from the royal guards and the growing crowd. The walk was quiet, and Oliver's mind raced. What had he really done wrong? He hadn't intended to cause harm. He had only wanted to have a laugh, maybe impress a few people with his boldness. But now, the officer's silence made it clear that there were serious consequences, even if he didn't fully understand them yet. The officer stopped in front of a small stone building. It was simple and unadorned, not nearly as grand as the royal palace, but there was an undeniable air of authority around it. "You'll need to be held here for a short time," the officer explained. "It's to ensure you understand the seriousness of what you did." Oliver felt his stomach tighten. He had expected to walk away from this, maybe with a little embarrassment, but at least free to continue his day. But now, being escorted into a building like this, with no clear idea of what was happening, made him feel more nervous than he had ever been. He had never been in trouble before, at least not like this. In his own country, he had always been able to do what he wanted, when he wanted, without much consequence. But here, in this foreign land, things were different. Inside the building, the officer led Oliver to a small room with a few chairs and a wooden table. The room was sparse, almost cold, and the atmosphere was heavy. It felt like a place meant for serious talks, not for the kind of lighthearted behavior Oliver had shown. He couldn't help but wonder if he had crossed a line he didn't even know existed. The officer sat down at the table and motioned for Oliver to do the same. "What you did wasn't just disrespectful to one guard," the officer said, looking at Oliver seriously. "It was a disrespect to an entire tradition. And traditions are important here. You need to understand that." Oliver nodded, his mind still trying to process everything. He hadn't realized that something so small could have such a big impact. It was just a guard, just a uniform. But now, the officer was explaining how much more it meant. It was about history, about respect for the people and their culture. He had made a joke out of something that wasn't a joke at all. "I didn't mean to offend anyone," Oliver said softly, the words sounding different now. It was one thing to joke around, but another to understand that his actions had affected more than just himself. The officer sighed, but there was no anger in his voice. "I know you didn't mean harm, but the fact is, what you did caused a disruption, and disruptions don't just go unnoticed. You'll need to make things right, not just with your words, but with your actions." The officer's calm tone was a reminder of how different the situation was from anything Oliver had ever experienced. He had taken things too lightly, but now, the reality of his actions was starting to sink in. There were consequences, real consequences, for his behavior. "I'll stay here for a while," Oliver said quietly. He wasn't sure what would happen next, but he had a feeling that this experience was going to change how he viewed things, maybe forever. He wasn't sure how long he'd have to stay, or what would happen after. But one thing was clear. He was learning a lesson he wouldn't forget. Oliver sat in the small room, his legs crossed nervously. He had no idea how much time had passed. The officer had left him alone for a while to reflect on what had happened. The silence felt heavy, and the room seemed even colder than before. Oliver shifted in his chair, glancing at the bare walls, and trying to ignore the growing discomfort in his chest. At first, he had thought he would be let off with just a warning. After all, he hadn't meant to cause any real harm. But now, as time passed and the weight of the situation settled on him, he realized how wrong he had been. The officer's calm voice echoed in his mind. Disruptions don't go unnoticed. Oliver had underestimated the significance of what he had done. He had thought of the Royal Guard as just a figure standing there, but now he understood that the Guard represented something much deeper. It wasn't just about a man in a uniform. It was about a tradition that had been respected for generations. It was about the history of the place, the people who lived here, and the values they held dear. As he sat there, Oliver couldn't help but think about how he had acted. He had been so focused on impressing others and having fun at someone else's expense that he hadn't stopped to consider how his actions might affect the people around him. He had thought it was all just a joke, but it wasn't. It was disrespectful, and now he had to face the consequences. A part of him still wanted to defend his actions. He wanted to say that it was just a harmless prank, that everyone should lighten up. But deep down, he knew that wasn't the truth. He knew that what he had done had crossed a line, even if he hadn't realized it at the time. And the worst part was that it wasn't just about him. His actions had affected others too. Suddenly, the door opened, and the officer re-entered the room. Oliver looked up, surprised but not relieved. He still didn't know what to expect next. The officer's face was serious, but there was a hint of understanding in his eyes. "You've had time to think," the officer said, "and I can see that you're beginning to understand the gravity of what you did. That's a good thing." Oliver nodded, unsure of what to say. He felt like he had learned a lot in such a short amount of time, but it wasn't enough to undo what he had done. The officer pulled a chair out from the small table and sat across from Oliver. "I'm not here to punish you," he said, his voice softening a little. "But there are some things that you need to understand. Sometimes, the smallest actions can have the biggest impacts. What might seem like a harmless joke to you can be deeply upsetting to someone else, and when that happens, it's your responsibility to make it right." Oliver looked down at his hands, feeling the weight of the officer's words. It was hard to admit that he had been wrong. He had never really thought about how his actions could affect others in the way that the officer was describing. It wasn't just about making people laugh or impressing them. It was about respect. And respect wasn't something you earned by being loud or flashy. It was something you gave, even when you didn't feel like it. The officer continued, "It's good that you've apologized, but you also need to understand that respect doesn't end with words. It's a matter of actions. And sometimes, it's about showing that you are willing to do more than just say you're sorry." Oliver nodded again. He was starting to understand what the officer meant. It wasn't enough to just say the words. He had to show, through his actions, that he truly meant it. "You'll need to demonstrate that respect," the officer said. "And the best way to do that is through your behavior. The next step is up to you. How you choose to move forward will show whether or not you've truly learned the lesson." Oliver sat there, taking it all in. The officer wasn't threatening him, but the words still stung. It was a lesson that felt both simple and complex at the same time. He hadn't expected to be put in this position, but now that he was here, he knew it was something he had to take seriously. It wasn't just about getting out of trouble. It was about becoming a better person. "Do you understand now?" the officer asked, his tone still calm but with an underlying sense of expectation. Oliver took a deep breath and looked the officer in the eye. "Yes," he said quietly. "I understand." The officer gave him a small nod of approval. "Good. Now, let's move on." Oliver stood up, feeling the heaviness of the moment start to lift. The apology was only the beginning. He still had more to prove, but for the first time in a long time, he felt ready to make things right. Oliver stood up from the small chair, feeling a mix of nervousness and determination. The officer had explained the next step, and now it was time for him to follow through. He had learned a lot over the past few hours, and while he wasn't completely sure about everything, he knew one thing for sure. He had to make things right. The officer led him back toward the royal guard, who still stood silently in his spot, as if nothing had changed. Oliver felt a bit of anxiety building in his chest as they approached. He had apologized earlier, but it hadn't been enough. This time, it had to be different. This time, his apology had to show that he understood what he had done wrong, and that he respected the tradition the guard represented. As they got closer, the crowd around them grew quieter. It was clear that everyone was waiting to see what would happen next. Oliver could feel their eyes on him, their silent judgment as he walked toward the guard. He could hear the soft murmur of voices, some curious, some whispering, but none of them spoke directly to him. It felt like the whole world was holding its breath. When they finally reached the royal guard, the officer stepped back and gestured toward Oliver. "Now is your moment," he said, his voice calm but firm. "Apologize. And mean it." Oliver took a deep breath. He could feel the tension in his body, but he knew this was something he had to do. This wasn't just about getting the situation over with. It was about showing that he had learned from his mistakes. He stepped forward, standing in front of the royal guard, who still hadn't moved or reacted. The guard's face was as serious as ever, but this time, Oliver didn't see it as a challenge. He saw it as a reminder of how important respect really was. "Excuse me," Oliver began, his voice a little shaky at first, but growing steadier as he continued. "I want to apologize for what I did. I was thoughtless and disrespectful. I didn't understand how much this tradition means, but now I do. And I'm really sorry for making light of it." Oliver paused for a moment, trying to find the right words. He had never felt so sincere before. This apology wasn't just about fixing a mistake. It was about understanding something much bigger. It was about showing that he had learned that his actions had consequences, and that those consequences affected more than just him. The crowd seemed to quiet even more, if that was possible. Oliver could feel the eyes of the people around him, watching closely to see how the guard would react. He wasn't sure what he expected, but he didn't want the apology to feel rushed or insincere. He took another deep breath and looked directly at the guard. "I know I can't take back what I did, but I promise you that I won't forget the lesson I've learned today," Oliver said, his voice a little stronger now. "You deserve respect. This tradition deserves respect, and I will be more mindful of that from now on." Oliver stood there for a moment, waiting for the guard to respond, but there was still nothing. The guard remained completely still, his face unchanged, his eyes focused ahead. But for some reason, that stillness didn't feel as intimidating anymore. Instead, it felt peaceful, as if the guard understood that Oliver was truly sorry, and that sometimes actions spoke louder than words. The officer, who had been standing quietly beside them, nodded slightly. "That was well done," he said softly. "You've taken the right step. But remember, apologies are not just words, they are actions. You must continue to show respect in your behavior, not just in what you say." Oliver nodded. The officer was right. The apology had been a good start, but it was just that, only a start. He knew he had more work to do, not just here in this moment, but in how he treated people and traditions in the future. It wasn't enough to just say the words and expect everything to be okay. He had to live by those words. As Oliver turned to leave, he felt lighter. The weight of the situation hadn't completely lifted, but it had shifted. He had done what he could to make things right, and that felt like a step in the right direction. He wasn't sure if the guard would ever forgive him, or if the crowd would forget his earlier behavior, but that didn't matter now. What mattered was that he understood the importance of respect and had learned to appreciate something bigger than himself. The officer gave him a small smile as they walked away from the guard. "Good work," he said, You've learned an important lesson today, and I believe it will stick with you." Oliver nodded, grateful for the officer's guidance. He still had a long way to go, but this was a beginning. And sometimes that's all it took, taking that first step toward understanding. Oliver stepped away from the Royal Guard, his thoughts racing. The officer had led him through what felt like an endless learning process, and now, standing there, he couldn't help but reflect on the whole experience. The embarrassment, the frustration, and the feeling of being completely out of place had all been worth it, he realized. They had taught him something important, something that went far beyond what he had expected when he first walked into the royal grounds. The crowd had slowly dispersed, but their stares still lingered in his mind. Some were curious, some were judgmental, but Oliver knew that he couldn't control their opinions. What mattered was how he felt inside. And right now, he felt different. The sense of arrogance that had once ruled his actions had faded, replaced by something far more meaningful: respect. He understood now that it wasn't just about making people laugh or getting attention. It was about acknowledging others, understanding their worth, and treating them with the dignity they deserved. As Oliver walked back through the palace gates with the officer, he could feel the shift inside himself. He wasn't the same person he had been when he first arrived. That brash, self-assured tourist had been replaced with someone more thoughtful, someone who appreciated the lessons that life, and even a small mistake, could teach. The reality of respect had hit him hard, and he knew it was something he had to carry with him from this point forward. "Do you feel different?" the officer asked, his voice calm but expectant. Oliver paused and looked around, taking in the beauty of the palace one last time. He had seen it through such a different lens now. What had once seemed like a simple tourist attraction was now filled with deeper meaning. The guards, the traditions, the people, everything had its place in a much bigger picture. And for the first time, Oliver was beginning to understand his place in it. "Yes," he said quietly, "I do." The officer smiled, a small, approving gesture. "Good. You've learned something today, not just about others, but about yourself." Oliver nodded. "I think I get it now. It's not just about doing what you want or thinking that your way is the best. It's about understanding other people's values, their customs, and showing respect, even if you don't fully understand why." The officer nodded in agreement. "Exactly. It's easy to assume that your own beliefs and actions are the right ones, but the truth is, everyone comes from a different place. The key is finding common ground and respecting the differences." Oliver felt a weight lift off his shoulders as the officer's words sunk in. He had always been quick to judge, to make fun of things he didn't understand. But now, he realized how damaging that could be. What had seemed like harmless fun had actually been hurtful to someone else. And worse, it had shown a lack of awareness that he had never even considered before. But now, he knew better. As they reached the exit of the royal grounds, Oliver turned back for one last look at the guard, still standing proudly at his post. The guard's expression was still stoic, unchanged by anything that had happened. But Oliver now understood what he had been standing for. It wasn't just a job or a duty. It was a symbol of something much bigger than himself, a tradition that deserved respect, a duty that came with pride, not arrogance. "I'll make sure to remember this," Oliver said quietly, more to himself than to the officer. "I won't forget." The officer gave a small chuckle. "You'll find that life often has a way of reminding you of the lessons you learn, whether you want it or not." Oliver smiled, realizing how true that was. He had learned more today than he had in weeks of traveling and sightseeing. And it wasn't from a guidebook or a famous landmark. It was from a simple mistake. A mistake that had cost him his pride, but had given him something far more valuable in return. As he walked away from the palace grounds, Oliver felt lighter. His journey wasn't over, but it had taken a new direction. He didn't know exactly what was ahead, but one thing was certain. He would approach it with a new mindset, one shaped by respect, humility, and a deeper understanding of the world around him. He had learned that the best way to stand out was not through jokes or attention-seeking behavior, but through simple acts of respect. And as he made his way through the city, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't felt before. A small change, but a change that would stay with him for a long time.